Hello, here we are going to talk topic 5, behavior and attitudes. We're going to break this topic up into 3 subtopics. Do attitudes predict behavior? And then we're going to go and flip it around and say, does behavior predict attitudes, right? Kind of flip them around. And after talking about behavior affecting attitudes, we're going to then ask the question in the third section, why? Why does our behavior affect our attitudes? Okay? So first, I guess we need to start, of course, with what is an attitude, right? I got an attitude, man. Yeah, so does all my teenage children. So attitudes are, a favorable or unfavorable. I won't pull my face out of there. A favorable or unfavorable evaluative reaction towards something or someone, blah, 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 blah. But take a look. What's important is the ABCs. Attitudes have 3 components. They have an affective component, of course, an emotional component. They have a behavioral component and a cognitive or a thought component. So we find that attitudes are not just, they're, and so what do we find is that these attitudes that we have often are an antecedent of behavior. So we're going to find that as we go through this topic that the attitudes predict the behaviors then go back and change the attitudes, which then go and predict the next behaviors. Okay, so it's a kind of a strange way to think about it. We can talk about the uses of attitudes. What's the function, psychological function? I like functionalism. From a utilitarian perspective, they help us to gain social approval from others. If we share attitudes with our peers and social group, then we're more likely to fit in. Right? We'll talk about conformity at some point. Knowledge. Attitudes help us to make sense of the world. It helps us to structure what might normally be a very large, unorganized set of knowledge. From more of a Freudian psychoanalytic perspective, they can act as an ego defense mechanism, that the attitudes that we have can defend ourselves from self-truths. Okay? Or more of a humanistic perspective, attitudes can help us to express who we are, something like that, to express the important parts of who we are. And so, yeah, attitudes affects actions, actions affect attitudes. There's a little picture of it. But what we find is that the relationship between attitudes and behaviors is not perfect. Okay? In fact, expressed attitudes are generally not that good because expressed attitudes aren't really always true. Because remember, anytime people know they're being observed, they tell you what might be politically correct. So there's as many as 40 factors that mediate. Mediate is a funky term when it comes to correlational research. Remember, in correlational research, you have an X variable and a Y variable, and changes in one variable predict changes in the other. Remember, we had said if somebody was exhibiting low self-esteem, then I predict that they'll also be exhibiting a high number of symptoms of depression, right? Remember, it's just prediction. But these relationships are clearly not causal. Remember, we had said experimental research is the only one where you say A causes B. Well, it turns out when it comes to this relationship between attitudes predict behaviors. But there are as many as 40 different things that get in between that relationship, including things like intentions or observation of behavior, and I'll kind of expand on both of these. Okay? So it's most clearly not a direct function. So we can only measure expressed attitudes, all right? And we don't know true attitudes necessarily. And so what happens is that during the 2016 presidential campaign, Donald Trump consistently polled quite low, but then on election day, you know what? I mean, people voted for him. Well, here was the basic philosophy behind that, was that saying that you support Donald Trump had become, and still has become, a politically incorrect thing. And so when people are asked in an opinion poll, they won't admit it. However, now if you measure an attitude in a non-reactive way, in other words, put somebody in a polling booth and it's private, guess what? Their true attitude may come out in when they poll, you don't poll anymore, but who you vote for, okay? So publicly expressed attitudes and privately felt attitudes may be polar opposites of each other. So that's 7. So we find that if you want to see, now I have an attitude towards squid. Okay, here's my attitude towards squid. Oh, bleh. But does my attitude towards squid predict my behavior towards squid? Guess what? Yeah, I mean, pretty well, but not perfectly. Not perfectly, because when there is a situational influence, listen to this. I was on a job interview one time, and I got taken out of a fancy Italian restaurant, and calamari was served, and so I had to eat up that calamari. Now, didn't I? Okay, so even though I have an attitude about squid, and it does a pretty good job of predicting, you don't really see the expression of the attitude except in aggregate. Okay, you can predict my average. On average, if squid is placed on the table, you can predict that my behavior will be avoidance. Okay, but if there's other situational influences, when in Rome, okay, sometimes you got to do what you got to do. We find when it comes to attitudes predicting behaviors, general attitudes don't do a great job. Specific attitudes do, in fact, predict specific behaviors. All right, I may have an attitude about. Oh boy, I can't. You put me on the spot here. Maybe I put myself on the spot. You have a general attitude about. Oh, car. I don't know. I can't come up with it. Okay, whatever. So the theory of planned behavior. Okay, the idea is that the attitudes that you have will combine with perceived social norms. And again, this might go back to the Donald Trump thing, where it's not politically correct, perhaps, to have that attitude and feelings of control. And what happens is that attitudes, perceived social norms, and feelings of control together determine intentions. Okay? And intentions are what guide the behavior. And so, according to this notion, you've got, as I said, this relationship between attitudes. Attitudes predict behaviors, but it's not. Attitudes lead to intentions. Attitudes plus other factors lead to intentions. Intentions lead to behavior. And so the predictive relationship between attitudes and behavior is really explained in this multi-dimensional model. That's at least the theory here. Attitudes that have been well thought out are good at predicting behavior. Those attitudes that we've just gained passively are less good at predicting behavior. And so I've always felt that that is one of the most important things that you as college students need to do is own your attitudes. You have attitudes towards religion. You have attitudes towards science. You have attitudes towards whatever you've got. And I'm not going to say your attitudes are, good or bad or correct or incorrect. But I'm saying it's on you as a college student to put the thought processes into them to own these things. I understand. In an interesting thing, every year that there's a presidential election, grade schools do this, fake election, mock election with the grade school students, and inevitably what's going to happen is that the results at the grade school are going to perfectly mirror what their parents are voting for. It's just how it's going to be, because if you're a little kid in elementary school, that's fine. You should just take your parents' attitudes, okay? That's the way it should be. But this is a very passive process. You, as an educated individual, eventually need to own your attitudes. Now, you grow up later and you want to, follow your parents' attitudes, but you've put the thought process into it. I respect it. It's good. If you want to flip on what your parents had at, that's fine, as long as you've put the thought process into it. So, well thought out attitudes, ones that you put the cognitive effort into, do a better job of predicting than just passively gained ones. Oh, this is an interesting one. Prejudicial attitudes predict discriminatory behavior. They did one study where they scored students on prejudicial attitudes. They got a prejudice score. We'll talk prejudice a little bit more later. And then what they did was the students then all got accidentally in the mail a scholarship letter. Right? It was not intended for them. They were not the intended recipient of it, and it was either a good news or bad news, and it was written to somebody else, but the somebody else was either what did they call it? A European target. That's just a nice way of saying white people. A European target or an Arab target, right? And so, lo and behold, those people that were high in prejudicial attitudes in general, it predicted their behavior in the situation. If it was a bad news about a scholarship, they were quick to submit it over to the Arab student. And if it was a good news, they didn't submit it to the Arabic student. So pretty clear in this case, the prejudicial attitudes that were measured did a good job of predicting the discriminatory behavior that followed. All right, very cool. So we wrap through that topic in a lickety split, and we'll come back in a couple of minutes, at least my couple of minutes, and move to the next one.